Hello and welcome to this conversation, which is part of the National Center for Writing's virtual residency, Meet the World. And in this conversation, I'm really excited to have two excellent writers, Akshita Nanda from Singapore and Irenisa Nokoje from Britain and Nigeria. I'd also like to thank, on behalf of the National Center for Writing, the National Arts Council of Singapore for supporting this residency, which is a virtual residency, just like our conversation is a virtual conversation. I'm going to introduce the two writers, and then I'm going to ask them both to read from a short story each. Akshita Nanda is a journalist, analyst, and author of the novels Beauty Queens of Bishan, Penguin Random House Singapore, and Nimita's Place, Epigram Books. Nimita's Place was adapted for the stage in 2019 by arts group T-Works, and in 2020 was joint winner of the Singapore Literature Prize for English Fiction. Akshita has a degree in cell and molecular biology from the National University of Singapore and a master's in international affairs from the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, NUS. Akshita's fiction explores the migration of people and ideas, beliefs, fashion, memes, technology, and also how the dislocated become local. During her residency, she's been focusing on how such migration is accelerated through globalization and how this changes people's lives. Irenisa Nokoje is a Nigerian-British author whose work pushes the boundaries of form, language, and ideas. Her novel Butterfly Fish, short story collections Speak, Gigantula, and New to Branch have won and been shortlisted for multiple awards. Her writing has been featured in the New York Times, The Observer, The Guardian, and the Huffington Post. She is the Vice Chair of the Royal Society of Literature and won the 2020 AKO Kane Prize for her story Grace Jones. She's the co-presenter of the BBC's Turn Up for the Books podcast, alongside Simon Savage and Bastille frontman Dan Smith. She's been a judge for various prizes, including the Dylan Thomas Prize, the Gordon Byrne Prize, as well as the BBC National Short Story Award. She's a contributing editor for The White Review. Her work has been optioned for the screen. In 2021, she was awarded an MBE for services to literature. And I'm Anjali Joseph. I'm a novelist and a mentor on the Meet the World scheme. So that's what I'm doing here. Right. I'd really love it if each of you would read a few minutes from one of your stories. Does anyone have a reference who'd like to go first?
Not me.
If not you, Irenisa.
I don't mind. What do you think?
No,
Akshita?
she doesn't.
You want to go
me.
first, or
No, please. I really loved the story you sent ahead of this, and I'm dying to hear it in your voice, literally. So please share an extract of
okay? I'll kick things off by popular request. So I'm going to read from my collection, which Anjali kindly mentioned, Nudibranch. This book here, collection of wild, weird, and fantastical short stories. In this particular story, Grace Jones, my protagonist is navigating a past trauma in the present in all sorts of strange, bizarre ways. So here's an excerpt. There was a building that remained a husk, a blackened charcoal carcass gutted from the inside out. The carcass leaned against the heavens in protest at its losses, at its snatched internal sky tainted with the fingerprints of one last daily procession, rituals of the living. And while the world slept, awoke, the cities hummed with chaos and order. Rivers began in cotton pockets cupping slackened fists. The waters undulated into lost reflections. The gods got high off the colours of the seas. The equator adjusted itself only slightly. The stars twinkled in haphazard collusion. The mountains dappled by harmattan winds that became personal directions. The building remains, an artificial gut bathed in degrees of light, lodged in the stages of the day. The building was a hollow within a carcass, within a husk, within a world, within a galaxy. A series of crooked boxes varying in size inside each other, where the gift was always the same, always attached to a bottom that had gone missing. On each floor of the husk, Sidra was running backwards to the late afternoon of a day. It had been flat-packed into cardboard boxes sealed with sellotape. On each floor, Sidra peeled off the sellotape, the sound a split in the air whose line couldn't be traced. She removed items from the box, The late afternoon that day was made up of ingredients for cake: eggs, flour, butter, sugar, tinfoil, a whisk, vanilla. On each floor, Sidra ran to the window where she stood in costumes made of tinfoil. On floor 1, she was covered with eggs, screaming. On floor 2, she was drenched in flour, howling. On floor 3, she was soaked in butter, melting as the heat intensified while the whisk whirred ominously on the periphery. And so on. Grace Jones's La Vie en Rose played on a radio that wasn't plugged in anywhere. Instead, the plug sprang from the bottom of the building like an untethered electrical root. The husk shook. On each floor, Sidra grabbed the whisk. Lost scenes fell from the windows. Water was inadequate. Hoses throbbed with adrenaline and burned hearts. Death traps, the lifts became stuck all over again, spewing firemen's costumes like overgrown fabricated insects. Like Genesis on speed, everything escalated quickly. Ashes assembled into figures crawling on the skyline before colliding with traffic, which destroyed them all over again. The equator turned a fraction. The flames rose. The bottoms of the crooked boxes were set alight. Debris became glowing cinders that walked. A dot appeared on the galaxy. The draftsman held a flame he angled like a stick of lead, like a tool that could change guise at any point. Sidra had first seen Grace on TV. She must have been around 13 at the time. She'd been chasing Carla and Dorianne, who were playing with a set of screwdrivers behind the sofa, darting forwards and backwards in a mock game of fencing, shouting "on guard" sporadically, brandishing the screwdrivers like long, elegantly carved swords. The washing machine was spinning. The windows were open to hide evidence of her botched attempt at gumbo. The smoke alarm was broken. Half an hour earlier, it had beeped incessantly. In her frustrated efforts to silence it, she'd broken it with a broom. But none of that mattered because a woman who looked like her was on TV. Pulled to the screen by an instinct she didn't quite understand, she stared. It was on BBC One. She'd never seen a black woman so unapologetically dark on the screen. It was beautiful, and she was hypnotized. Dressed in an all-black catsuit, the woman was tall, striking, otherworldly, confident. Her mouth painted fire engine red. Her head was in an off-yellow helmet shaped like a bee's nest. Sidra half expected a swarm of bees to hover over the woman's head, the queen bee in action. She felt as if they'd shared the same womb, separated by a few decades, and a trail of bees packed with mutual DNA and womb lining. Grace Jones, they said. Grace Jones. She repeated the words aloud, feeling them roll up her tongue while the washing machine spun, while Carla and Dorianne swapped the screwdrivers for Power Ranger toys, starting wars in patois. The screen jumped, flickered. The picture vanished. Grace had been brought to her on a signal from Jupiter. She grabbed the hanger on the floor behind the TV, stretched its curved head and inserted it into the television's aerial socket. The picture returned. Grace was gone, replaced by an item on an infected brand of milk. Her heart sank, but the image of Grace was burned into her head as if with an iron. She ran to her mother's room, opened her makeup drawers, searching through the lipsticks, pouting her lips. She flung the wardrobe door open, its mirrors multiplying her automatically. She dived in. In the dark, she heard the flutter of a wing. A bee with a fire engine red mouth floated in a trail of static. I'll stop there. Thank you so much.
Anshita, would you like to read?
Yeah, I just need to catch my breath after that. I have to say, Sam, this was the first time we've met, but I felt such a connection to your story, Great John, because I also write about migrants and people trying to find their identity. Also, the burden that we bear, as we try to take on an identity that is our own and yet displaced. And your work is really powerful. So thank you. I'm really excited to be here with you.
Oh, thank you so much. I really appreciate that. And I'm floored by your bio and the incredible things that you've achieved. And I'm so excited to hear your work and be in conversation with you both. Anjali is also amazing, and I followed her work and career as well. So I feel like this is just a lovely gathering of women and powerful voices. And what you say about identity, I mean, it's so interesting, isn't it? The way it morphs and changes and how space and place impacts it as well. So ditto, really being thrilled to be in conversation with you too, and Anjali as well.
And what you just said, Erin, about how identity morphs and changes depending on place is actually what I'm working on right now. Anjali's read one of an ongoing work in progress, which is the Connection short stories about the migration of a person as well as ideas. And also the idea that migrants, wherever we go, because I'm a migrant myself, we're kind of monstrous and also a little magical because, the way we slip into a different identity or culture. So this first story it's still a work in progress. I won't read very much from it, but it's called Vampires in Tokyo. And I'll just read the extract. The morning sandwich display in the konbini was picture perfect. It would make an excellent reference for a future manga background. Lata took a photo with her cell phone before selecting her breakfast. The woman staffing the counter had a mask on and a blouse and coughed hard as Lata swiped her card to pay. Instead of thanking Lata verbally, she raised her hands, showing first 3 fingers and then 9. 3 and 9 were fun and kyu in Japanese. Sa-kyu was the shorthand for thank you that Tokyo service staff were using instead of spraying their COVID germs into the customer's face. Lata would normally have taken her sandwich and coffee to the bench outside the konbini, but the street was jammed with rushing pedestrians and unusually noisy traffic. The TV above the coughing cashier's head explained why. A collision further along Setagaya Road had left a motorcycle rider with a broken leg. Footage showed an ambulance speeding away. The TV suddenly braved the announcer's surprise. Breaking news: the ambulance was returning to the accident scene. Live footage showed the paramedics gently offloading a stretcher with a visibly bleeding man still on it. The NHK reporter who had rushed to the scene spoke excitedly as the injured man was placed on the sidewalk and the stretcher removed. A paramedic placed an air cushion under the patient's head. Another placed a blanket over him. The injured man screamed. One of the paramedics bowed his head. The other tried to wave away the news crew. The camera panned to include gawkers and agitated pillars of the community. A man wearing an apron and holding a bunch of carrots was haranguing the paramedics. A constable was trying to calm things down. The paramedic spoke to the camera. The motorcyclist had tested COVID positive on his way to hospital. He was running a fever, look. The constable, who was leaning down to the injured rider, stood up again. The hospital wouldn't take him. What were we to do? The paramedics asked. You can't leave him outside my store. It's bad for business, said the man with the carrot. Can he wait inside your store? Asked the paramedic. Or in the police booth? The greengrocer retreated. The constable raised his hand. This isn't my responsibility. The paramedics tried to return to the safety of the ambulance. The NHK reporter got in their way. Isn't this evading your responsibility? Don't you have a duty to the injured? The paramedics huffed, sweat beading above their masks. We're carrying out our duty, all right. We took him to the nearest hospital. If the hospital won't accept this patient, what are we to do? The NHK reporter thrust her microphone at them. The whole responsibility is this. The camera pans the crowd. What do you all think? A woman in a grey suit spoke. Isn't this a matter for law and order? What do you say, Constable? The constable shook his head. I have to check with my superiors at the booth. Hey, you! He shook his hand at a bunch of teenage girls. Stop filming. This isn't a circus. So that's just it from my ongoing work in process, Vampires in Tokyo, which tells the story of an Indian migrant who hopes to become a world-renowned mangaka and comics artist. Their future stories to sort of follow her journey.
I love that reading. Oh my goodness, it was so colourful and sharply observed. It felt like being placed in a live news report. I was, all the different colourful characters. It was so brilliant. Thank you.
You have some like kind of illustrations and sort of what's the word, speech bubbles and kind of stuff from the kind of visual furniture of comics, right, in the story as well. So that's the sort of element that, yeah.
Absolutely. And that's all your fault, Anjali, because as my mentor, you suggested that this is about a mangaka, I should work some comic elements into it. And that's really given the work a whole new dimension as I've been studying. Pretty much, manga is very influential. It's one of those mimetic forms of entertainment and information, soft power. And so this story very much has manga panels, speech bubbles, little WhatsApp chat going on all the time, because I'm really interested in how we communicate. And, we may use different platforms like Riverside or WhatsApp or whatever, but the essentials of human communication are the same. We have our goals, our desires, and we all kind of want to get somewhere and meet somebody.
My brother would love you because he's a big manga fan. So yeah, I can't wait to read this collection actually, because it sounds fascinating. And yeah, completely up my street. And I love the element of giving it these other dimensions as well, like drawing on that manga influence, on that sort of playfully experimental aspect of manga as well, so that the work feels, it feels sort of multi-pronged in a way. It's not just one type of book. Do you know what I mean? Yeah.
I wanted to subtitle this event Transforming the City, because it really stood out to me that in both your work there's a huge interest in and employment of transformation as a sort of as a creative force. So I have a sort of some question for each of you. In Renaissance, several of the stories in Nudibranch, I was saying Nudibranch, what a fool.
That's correct.
Several of the stories in Nudibranch deal with, if not always exactly urban situations, but different types of organized societies. There's a monastery, or there's a kind of commune, and in one of them there's London and Sydney, Kookaburra Street. And these are sort of spaces of transformation and continual mutation. One line that I literally laughed aloud at because it was so sort of just such genius was a hologram sat on a roof smoking a blueprint. And when you read it, you're like, yeah, and then you think, what? How would that even work? And what would that look like? So there's a way in which I loved how your stories in Nudibranch are really kind of continually almost reaching a hand into the reader's brain and just sort of massaging things, like relatively gently but sort of persistently. Like this sentence that has a form of referring to things that a reader might understand, but it's also very kind of defiantly intangible. And I was hoping you could talk a little bit about how you compose stories that are set in these almost relentlessly dynamic worlds.
Thank you so much. I mean, firstly, I have to say that I am somebody who loves language. I was a voracious reader, so I'm always looking at stories and ideas, but also how I can bend them. How I can push the boundaries, how I can make them subversive, because I can't write a straight story. I'm literally just incapable of doing that. I've tried, but I can't do it. And I admire people who can do it, but in my brain and the way I look at the world, things are always changing and mutating. I'm fascinated by the combination of the everyday and the surreal. And often, actually, real life, it can be very, very strange. So this space, really, I guess, is a way of looking at, in my original intention, looking at my lived experiences. And I read so much, but I noticed that the experiences of Black people and people of colour were missing in books. And that really used to frustrate me a lot. One of the first books I read when I moved to this country, because I also was, an immigrant too, so I know that experience, was Fantastic Mr. Fox by Roald Dahl. And it was just brilliant. I mean, it was just zany, weird. Animals were taking revenge. They were mischievous. And it was darkly humorous as well. And it kind of opened up my brain in a way that I didn't expect. This combination of growing up in Nigeria, between Lagos and Benin, the kind of vibrancy of that, and being exposed to oral griot storytelling, where the stories themselves would mutate depending on who told you the same story. The ending might change, the middle might be different, one character might be missing, replaced by another character, so it was like nothing was. This sort of slipstream world of stories seems to be in my DNA. It seems to be something that I carried in my body. So in some ways, it feels like I'm kind of leaning into my natural intentions when I come to the page. But also, I really see writing these stories about, people of color, Black people, people on the cusp of some sort of change or at crossroads in their lives, as a space to play and experiment. I want to transform those lived experiences, but in unusual contexts, or in contexts that people don't often see people of color in. And it's not like they don't exist. They do exist. Octavia Butler was writing Black people into the future in the 60s and 70s, defiantly and unapologetically writing sci-fi. And I'm sure lots of people told her, what the hell are you doing in this space? You don't belong here. How dare you do that? But I just loved that she was so fiercely defiant. So, people like her, Octavia, the Toni Morrisons, the Arundhati Roys, these defiant, incredible women who, write about our experiences in ways that they feel recognizable, but they also feel new. That is the place that I'm coming from, and to me, it's a really dynamic place to operate from. Akishta mentioned similarly that when she's thinking about identity and the way we transform in spaces, it's so true. How we turn up aspects of ourselves and dial down aspects of ourselves in degrees depending on which space we're in. I remember moving to this country for the first time, and I was in boarding school in Norfolk, and I didn't realize that, people, the kind of social codes were different. In Nigeria, it's like you say exactly what you think, you say what you think. And so I came to this country doing that, but I made so many social faux pas in the beginning because I realized, actually, you don't say what you mean. It's much more subtle the way people communicate. So learning those things was really, really interesting, and also discovering my voice in that process was very, very exciting. But yeah, this has been a very long-winded answer. I'm sorry about that. I'm going to hand over to Akishta.
Yeah, so I really love that answer. And while you were speaking, I was thinking about both of you actually as writers who do have a certain, let's call it defiance, but about conforming to a sort of prefab idea of what a short story should be, like a prefabricated idea. That there is Akshita, in your work, there's a real playfulness and also sort of experimentation about form. And Irenison is like such lovely poetry in your work, and also this kind of almost breakneck speed mutation that's happening the whole time, which kind of almost invites the reader into a sort of dynamic creative space with the writer, which I think is really lovely. And also, while you were speaking, I was wondering if, in fact, because we know that the world is continually changing, right? Like everything is, in fact, in flux. Maybe your perception of that is, maybe you're just one of the few people that haven't had that disabled in your kind of perceptions of life in some way. Maybe the rest of us have been schooled to sort of think of entities as continuous, and you think of one character moving through a novel and basically being the same, at least legally the same person at the beginning and the end. And maybe that's a bit of an illusion that we don't necessarily have to buy into. I definitely feel like that after reading your fiction. Akshita, one of the stories that I've had the pleasure of working with you on has been about the idea of the meme. Actually, that's the story that you read from, right? And it's in fact a hand gesture that turns into sort of urban myth that comes to life. Could you talk more about that and about how the city and its life inspire you?
Sure, thank you for that. And just riffing off on what Irinoti said, I think that exposure to oral myth and tradition is probably one of the things that informs my writing as well, because in the oral tradition, the story changes depending on who's telling it. And I am an oral storyteller. My family comes from a practice of oral storytelling, including kirtans, where they retell epic battles or histories or legends from the Mahabharata. So when I pin an idea down on paper, more so than the normal writer, I find it really weird because in my head, the story is always morphing and taking on so many permutations and combinations. And in the past, that was okay because you could tell the story in one village and tell it another way in another village. And now with the internet, we have fan fiction. We have so many ways of telling the same story again and again. And ownership is not just to the writer. Ownership is a way of ensuring that the writer and the people behind getting the story to the marketplace makes them profit from it. But the idea is free. It's eternal. It's living in people's brains and changing them, a bit like a virus, a bit like a meme. And the speed at which that happens is just absolutely amazing. So when I write, I try to capture something of that and experiment with the form, maybe through, photographs, etc. But it doesn't, to me, that doesn't actually literally embody what a story does. The story becomes part of you. A meme becomes part of you and changes how you react, like dabbing, right? Everybody remembers what it is, even if they never saw the original video. So in my story, I wanted to show how something very simple and innocuous could suddenly take on a life of its own and create a whole subculture of people who just, repeat the same gesture, use that gesture to identify important people. And so the story begins with the Jabi is a very interesting language. I speak it partially. And very often, rather than using the original word, they'll use pani. Instead of thank you, I have actually seen this, that people will use 3, which means sun, and 9. So sun, Q, thank you. So it just seemed to me that in a time where people were afraid of speaking, the hand gesture would replace that. And then there's another way of reading the same characters for 3 and 9, or rather the sounds that they make. And when that is read out, it means vampire. So the mimetic gesture became a really important part of the story. I'm still not entirely convinced I've figured out how to embody a physical meme in text, but that's part of the journey and part of the fun of exploration.
This is a question for both of you. There are many great short story collections that revolve around cities or a single city. And just off the top of my head, I thought of Dubliners or Calvino's Invisible Cities or Eileen Chang's Love in a Fallen City. Are there any short stories or short story collections that you return to or that have stayed in your imaginations, and what is it about them that draw you in?
Oh, that's a great question. Yeah, I have to think of a couple of my favorites. So first one I think would be Dennis Johnson's Jesus' Son. It's the first short story collection I ever read. It's quite a small collection as well, but it was so brilliantly freewheeling and unexpected. It's about a drug addicts, basically, on the fringes of society, and they are interconnected short stories. So it sort of brings you into his world and the characters that he, sort of socializes with. But there was just a real empathy there that I really liked. There was a lack of judgments, but it was also, Johnson's ability to do a sleight of hand in the sentence just blew me away. So I love what he did with the form. And I didn't know at the time that the short form could do that. I was always somebody who'd read novels. I didn't know you could invest in a short story world in that way. So I was like, wow. And also there was the element of experimentation in it as well, So that really kind of spoke to me at the time. The other collection that I really, really loved is Miranda July's No One Belongs Here More Than You. It's just incredible. It's strange, liminal, hilarious. Very, very funny. Interesting that she's also a filmmaker as well. So you can, and some of the pieces I think are quite filmic. You can see that kind of mixture of playing moving between mediums, even in her collection. So I really love that collection. And then the other one I have to give a shout out to is J. California's Cooper's Some Love, Some Pain, Some Time. So she is a Black American writer. I don't think lots of people are familiar with her work, but the first time I read that collection, I wept. It was just very, very simple stories about everyday Black people in America, but they were so profoundly moving and beautifully written, very different to the denseness of my work, completely opposite, not experimental at all, but wow, what a voice. So yeah, I have to give a shout to those three for now.
Yeah. So for me, it's a bit complicated, that question, because I'm really attracted to writers who write about a place, because I like to dive into the place, but then I realize I'm also diving into the people as well as the unique characteristics of that place. For example, P.G. Wodehouse, when he wrote about Blandings Castle, but also when he wrote about America, because he had a very different view of it. Agatha Christie, when she writes about the England pre-war, post-war, it's just fascinating. R.K. Narayan, Malgudi Days, there's just such a lot of love and simplicity. But there's one woman I'm actually thinking of called, I think, Ismat Chugtai or Apat, and she used to write Urdu short stories. Now, I can't actually read Urdu, but I have seen and heard her short stories performed, and they just swept me away, because they talked about qualities of places and people that I didn't know existed, because I'm originally from India. So obviously we only ever know our own experience, and Ismat Chughai's short stories exposed me to the idea of there being this social class was not always a good thing for women, because you had more restraints when it came to people who were richer, because they kind of had a face and a reputation to maintain in society, whereas people who were underprivileged and also very, very, therefore, prone to exploitation, yet had a certain weird kind of freedom. So, and I think that, your social class would change how you experience the train, because you could afford a seat or you were sitting on top of a carriage, that sort of thing. So, but I think what really, really has stood out to me is the notion that whenever women write about women in place, it's very different from when non-women write about women in place. Because wherever a woman is, she's kind of not quite belonging there, not quite seen as the dominant narrative. So to me, any female short story, right, I stop in the library or in the bookstore and I'm like, okay, I got to see what you have to say about the world and your place in it.
And I want to move to a more general question about the short story. You're both novelists as well as short story writers. Maybe that's an artificial distinction anyway. What do you think about that? How does it feel when you're writing short stories? Do you put a short story writer's hat on and only read and think about short stories? Or are you simultaneously working on several things at a time, if it's poems or stories or longer fiction or things in other forms? And what do you enjoy about writing short stories that other forms don't offer in the same way?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I love both forms. With the short story, there's an ending. There's an ending inside. You finish. And when I was finding my voice, that was really helpful to me, to be able to just have this fermentation of ideas, realize one, then realize another, and they all be different from each other. I had written a novel before I started writing short stories, and it was, Dennis Johnson's collection that actually sparked and encouraged me to start writing short fiction, because at the point which I was at, I was sort of frustrated. I'd written that first draft of the novel. I didn't know what to do with it. I was exhausted. I thought, I can't look at it again right now. But I didn't want to stop writing. So I started writing short stories. And it was very, very liberating. I just love the form. For me, the short story enabled me to find my voice. I credit it with being the space that allowed me to say, yes, I'm an experimental writer, and really embrace it. The stories I wrote for my first collection, Speak Gargantua, they were raw stories. Yeah, I didn't really know what I was doing, but I just had fun on the page. And I was very clear that I wanted to write about my lived experiences in a way that didn't feel unencumbered, and the short form, writing about place, writing about Blackness, writing about what it means to be a young Black woman, finding my voice in the city, not being seen sometimes, and the toll that can take on you, but also the joy of claiming space, of saying, I am present and, I matter. I found that on the page, and particularly with short stories, So once I was kind of in the groove of that, it was like there was no stopping that excitement and enjoyment. Whereas with the novel, what happened was I then sort of Jedi mind tricked myself, went back to the novel and pretended like each chapter was like a short story, like they were in. That was how I was able to get over that mountain of how do I do a second draft. But that novel process is also fascinating. It's also unexpected because you don't know what's going to come. And for me, it's really a process of investigation. I don't go to that place knowing or being particularly structured in terms of how a character or characters are going to develop. And that for me allows space for sort of strange things to happen. And I really like that. So there is something in each form. There's something I get from both of those mediums. And it's interesting that, sometimes you can't, it's a particular sort of magic writing, isn't it? I think it's just, you can't really define it or describe it. It elevates you to a completely different space, I think, when at its core, when it feels really, really wonderful. It's a wondrous thing, to be able to access that liminal space. So both of those forms do that for me. And I can't say which one I prefer, but I really enjoy going along for the ride, to see what happens. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a bit like asking which of your children you prefer, isn't it?
Right?
I think the emphasis wasn't so much on which is better. It's more kind of how do you metabolize each experience? Like how does it feel writing a novel? How does it feel working on short stories for you?
So I love the fact that you've used the metaphor I was going to use anyway. A short story is like a meal, an ice cream, whereas a novel is a bit of nutrition. It's a long-term plan, and you have to sort of stick to it. Okay, because what I love, when I really fell in love with a short story was when I read, fell in love again with a short story, was when I read Jennifer Egan's Farewell to the Goon Squad, which is a series of linked short stories. And that was when I realized, oh wait, so I do love writing in different voices. I do love surfacing different stories. And in the past, you could do that in a novel, like something like The Lord of the Rings, for example. People have the patience to sit through that. The writer had the patience and the lack of tendonitis to be able to write that over several years. But with a short story now, the payoff is a little bit more immediate. And there's also a bit more of flashing your technique and taking on new challenges and mastery. I see that very often in Netflix specials, right? You have episodic stories, but there's like an underlying theme that puts everything together. When a reader picks up a book of short stories, they can like, oh, I want to feel sad, I'll go here. I want to laugh, I'll go here. Hopefully the title's a bit of a guide. That's the same for the writer. When I'm feeling fun and light and frothy, I'll write about vampires in Tokyo. If I'm feeling a certain emotion, I might write about Dragons in Fall, which is the one I'm working on right now. So it's different between like a quick high-intensity Tabata workout that's move away from food and something more healthy. We rather get a bad rep for not moving enough, but at the short story, I have to say at least I can finish it in a period of time and go out and have a bit of a life, as a draft digest. With a novel, everything goes to heck, including nutrition.
Yeah, I hear you. There's definitely more immediate gratification with a short story. Both of your work is really noteworthy for being interested in many things. Akshita, your first novel explored the dramas of a young woman, and the stories that you're working on now bring in some of your academic research interests from the area around Singapore. And at Renison, I was surprised and delighted by all the things that the stories in Nudibranch take an interest in: natural history, myth, science, dream. can each of you describe what it feels like when you get interested in something, and what's your organic process for metabolizing or digesting that fascination? How do you follow it? Do you geek out and make notes on things? Do you sort of consciously decide to include it in your fiction? How does it get processed through you?
Sure, yeah. I mean, in different ways, depending on the story or the project. Sometimes I get an image that comes to me, and I'm like, "Whoa, that's a really strong image." You know, how can I create around this? I remember for Speak Gargantua, one of the stories is about a woman who finds a tiny man in the garden, takes him hostage, and starts to torture him, and has him as a companion for a while. But it's a story about grief and processing grief. And, you know, the reader doesn't discover that to the end. But I was interested in that theme. You know, what does it feel like? The stages of grief. What does it look like? You know, that anger, that resentment, the pain of it. And how can I kind of play around with it in a way that feels fable-like, but also illuminating, you know. So, and the first thing that came to me was an image. And I think that's because I love galleries and exhibitions. I'm always going to see, you know, women's work, because Kashti, you mentioned that earlier. I'm really interested in women artists, not just writers, but across different mediums, because I think, you know, as we've touched on, they have so much to say and they're so interesting. So, you know, sometimes an idea can come from going to an exhibition or going to attending a one-woman play or one-woman monologue and sitting in the audience and thinking, God, that bit of dialogue has opened up something in me and I really want to explore this emotion, you know. Or it could be that, you know, I watched a film and I'm like interested in the subject matter and I think, oh God, this is really fascinating, like women in Madagascar and what they experience. And, you know, I might go and geek out a little bit and research that. I remember seeing on CNN, there was a little item about albino people in Africa and what they experience. And that intrigued me because they are persecuted, you know. So like the ordinary person, everyday person can go about their business, but you know, they are often hunted and killed for their body parts, and it's really terrible. But I was really interested in that experience and kind of giving them space. So I then like did a little bit of research, and from that I had a character in mind, and from that I honed in. I didn't geek out too much researching because I thought I want to feel For me, it was about the emotion of this character, and you know, they're returning back home to Mozambique after their mother's death. They've become this great architect, and you know, they travel around the world, and they've made something of their life from quite a difficult beginning. So it was interesting to be able to play with that and chart that journey. So that wasn't so much about, you know, researching too much. I did a little bit of research, watched that brief item on the news, and then I was just very sort of strongly invested in creating a world around him. With my novel Butterfly Fish, yeah, I did quite a bit of research for that too. And my dad sent me books, because part of the story is set in the 18th century kingdom of Benin. And my dad used to tell me stories about that as a kid, and I was really obsessed with that history, that bit of Black history, because it was so fascinating and amazing. And I was like, why aren't they teaching this in schools? You know, so for me, it was like a kind of claiming or reclaiming of my history, which gave me so much strength and courage. And then off the back of that, I was just obsessed with writing the book for 7 years. It took me 4 years to write the first draft, but the obsession started from childhood. I blame my dad. He planted that seed in me. And then I was just like, you know, I had to create this book. So yeah, I think it just depends really, the different things that spark inspiration, and not just spark it, but make you invested in continuing, you know, to want to create and see it through. So it's a mix of everything really. Sometimes it can be having a conversation with another woman. I cannot tell you how life-giving and energizing these conversations are. You know, they're so important to me when I think about, and I'm sure it's the same for you guys, when I think about women in my life who've made such a difference, who make me feel like, you know, the work that we do is important. it's incredible. So women are also, I think, a key factor in the mix in terms of how and why I create. Yeah.
And Akshita, what about your kind of research cycle and when you get interested in things?
This is just such a fascinating question. Thank you for it. And I like even a lot of my process comes from exposure to other artists, conversations with other people, especially women, non-binary, non-men, because we have ways of seeing the world that are not dominant and surfacing things that otherwise go overlooked. And what I'm very interested in is the narrative that we are not heavy. We don't read about women scientists. We don't read about women warriors. We don't read about kingdoms in Africa. But once we start having conversations, we realize that they existed, and somewhere there is research to back this up. So I have some classmates nursing my master's from Nigeria, Lagos actually. And when we were talking, I found out that the Igbo people in Nigeria actually wear these ceremonial textiles called Royal Madras cotton handkerchief. And that led me to research...
Royal Madras?
Yes, Royal George, Royal Madras cotton handkerchief. And that led me to researching how textiles have been crisscrossing the ocean and patterns, from the subcontinent, the Indian subcontinent on the way, and how they've been picked up, like in Indonesia, we got different patterns, different schemes, a lot of trade going back and forth. We've got the inheritance of this particular pattern in Nigeria, where people actually use it for wrapping babies or, pregnant women, or for laying a corpse out. And it just made me realize that, wow, you don't actually, as a writer, one needs to imagine things, yes, but if you observe, there is a wealth of information and resources out there, and truth is so much stranger than fiction. If I suggested to a publisher in Singapore, even in India, listen, I want to write about these textiles that go to Nigeria every year, they'd be like, we'll wear it in Nigeria, maybe, or something like that. Or who buys textiles anyway, don't they just fall to the trees? Because we don't know about so much of the world, we just inhabit it. So what I like to do is look at the stories and the processes that our world is made of and kind of tease them apart. And then the bits that interest me, either I research them through academic writing. We have a fabulous library system in Singapore through which I can access loads of academic text online or borrow books. So unlike Erin Olsen, I might spend just as much time, years in fact, researching something before I sit down and write it. And like with my first novel, I spent over a year researching it. With the short stories I'm writing now, every day I'm learning that I couldn't make stuff up. It actually already happened. I want this to happen for the purposes of plot, but it already exists. Does that not make me creative? I do not know.
Shakespeare had commonplace books full of stuff that he thought he was gonna, and did make use of from other places. So I think the sort of projection of creative people, like you as a writer, that just making up plot points is the kind of basis of being creative is pretty dubious. But
oh, good.
I think we've only got time for one more question. So I'm going to kind of merge the last two. It's kind of about life outside work, but then in a way, from what both of you have been saying, and I certainly believe this, I don't think an artist really has any life outside their work. It's all your work, even if you're watching rubbish TV or doing the washing up or having a conversation with a friend or whatever. It's really, there's something still present, kind of on the lookout for elements that are going to creatively excite you. But I was wondering, just thinking about the fact that we're all having this lovely conversation, and it's a virtual conversation, and also that you're doing a virtual residency in National Centre for Writing, and these concepts have sort of become so much part of our lives, and in some ways almost embodied existence feels very pre-2020. What sort of effect has just the world outside had on your writing in the last couple of years, Sophia?
Yeah, no, it's definitely been a tricky time in some ways. At the beginning of the pandemic, that was very difficult for me because I actually got it, and I got a really horrible bout of it. I was struggling to breathe for sometimes up to 8 hours a day when I caught COVID. And it took me, in terms of recovering, over 4 to 5 months to properly recover. So when I did, when I did survive it, everything felt like the best thing in the world. A bacon sandwich was the best bacon sandwich in the world. A walk with my dog was the best walk in the world. A conversation between me and my sister was the best conversation. It just, what it did was, it makes you appreciate life that much more and kind of hold people who are close and dear to you closer. So that was one effect. The other effect was, because of everything that was happening, I couldn't really write that much. Actually, for a while, I was very impressed by people who could. Some people produced 2 novels. Some people wrote wow, incredible. I think for me, so much was happening, in my world with losing family members and all kinds of things, that the writing process became slow, and I was okay with that. And also I took an interest in, different types of writing. I was writing more essays, actually, more hybrid essays, and, kind of playing around with that, and exploring and interrogating that form, because, obviously the novel and the short story I love, but I don't really write essays that much. So it was interesting. And I discovered, actually, I really like writing them, but writing them in my way, as in playing with them, not necessarily writing them in the typical way. So that was fun, to be able to sort of give myself permission to explore, a different sort of writing. So it's kind of been up and down, and I think that that's okay. You have to allow space to recognize the experiences that we're going through, and also that we carry a lot. As women, we carry a lot. I mentioned my sister, who's very, very close to me, and she has epilepsy, and she lives with me, and she has other health conditions. So I'm also kind of writer, carer, arts project manager. I'm also like running workshops. I'm also doing, the writer's hustle, in which, you freelance and you do different things to survive. But like you said, I really like the way you phrased that, which is that it's, even when it's not writing, it all goes somewhere. It all feeds into it. So on those days, or when I have those periods where I feel like, oh, I'm not doing any writing, and I feel lousy or guilty about it, it's good to remember that actually it all will go somewhere. And it's okay to give yourself those rest periods too. So the world outside is endlessly fascinating, tumultuous, and it's about giving myself permission to have space and take space when I need it, but also to embrace writing when I'm excited by it. In the past, I would always write frenetically. I was writing back to back to back to back to back, and never really took a break. So it's been nice, actually, to have a bit of a break and to come back to it in a place of excitement again.
So Akshita, can you speak about life outside work, if that exists, and how, but also how the last couple of years have kind of fed into your writing practice, or modulated it, or...
So it's been very interesting in Singapore, because in large parts of Asia, we're very, very compliant with masking, with lockdown routines, etc. So it meant that immediate interaction was in this small bubble of people. What meant was that I used to be dependent on stimulation by, going out to cafes, observing people, taking long walks. And a lot of that was not possible with lockdown restrictions where I live. So I turned to the internet for comfort and found a world on fire on social media. So like Erin Ozen said, this was not very conducive to writing. I had to change my process. I had to rather go inside myself and also find a little bit of spiritual comfort through studying different faiths and, learning from the wisdom and resilience of those who have come before us and gone through similar things. And now that things have opened up, we're vaccinated, we're meeting other people, I've realized that I am very dependent on people as a writer. But there are various modes of connecting with people. As Erin Ozen said, you held your loved ones close, you found other ways to communicate. And I also realized that we don't just communicate through being in each other's presence. There's this virtual element to it. And then I've become obsessed with the fact that we share a globalized virtual space. We share an internet with submarine cables connecting us all, and yet people are fighting over borders and territories and who has the right to migrate and live somewhere. So that tension and ridiculousness continually exists in my mind. People have been saying with the war in the Ukraine, all Russia has to do is to cut the submarine cables and then the Ukraine doesn't have the internet. They haven't done that, because when we cut off someone else, we cut ourselves off as well. And that's been one of the biggest lessons of the past few years, that, I might think that I'm sitting here writing in isolation, but actually I'm connected to a much larger, broader world. And that calls for care, that calls for compassion, and figuring out how that can impact my writing is one of my current challenges.
Oh, that's a beautiful answer to finish on. Well, I'd just like to thank you both again for a really sparkling, delightful conversation. And thank you so much for watching this. And thanks to National Centre for Writing and also to the National Arts Council of Singapore for sponsoring the residency. If you're watching this and you aren't familiar with the work of either of these writers, I really encourage you to go out and engage with their work and buy their books because they're really awesome. So thank you both so much. This was really lovely. And
Thank you so much for
This has
steering
been
the
amazing.
conversation so beautifully. What an enriching, fascinating conversation. I felt like we could have talked for about 3 hours, actually, to be honest.
definitely.
There's so much there.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I can't wait for your book, Ekishta. I'm really looking forward to your collection.
Well, thank you very much. I have just been so inspired by reading your work. It's almost it's triggered something in me. You've made me feel in a way that I wasn't really thinking about, and I'm just so grateful for the inspiration you've provided.
Oh, that's so lovely. Well, there you go. Those days where I feel like I can't write a sentence, I will remember that you said that. And Anjali, I'm very excited about you. What are you working on next? When is next thing coming?
Oh, it's also gestating very slowly, but I'm probably in the kind of geeking out research stage.
Oh, that's a nice place
myself.
to be.
Which I am enjoying.
Yeah, that's a really good place, isn't it?
Yeah.
Soak it up. Well, we can't wait whenever you're ready to release that
Thank
out
you so
into the
much.
world. But yeah, what a joy today was. Thank you both.